Hello and welcome to lesson number 1 in module 215, Advanced Behavior Management and Programming. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to pass the course and begin the process of reviewing some important but underlying concepts. A lot of people hear that concept of review and think, well, I've come through this material before, and so I'm just going to kind of rush through it. And I like to start this module by giving a little bit of an explanation as to why that shouldn't be done. I don't always get to teach this module in the form you're going to get it this year. It really comes down to the number of school days in a given year. And sometimes this content is a part of other modules, but I'm not really given the opportunity when that happens to give people a really operational ability to understand these concepts. Instead, they understand them well enough to be able to recognize them or know what's going on, instead of to be able to actually implement them or to design something or to analyze something that other people are using. So this is really aimed at giving people tools that they can use and go out and apply. Not only will that make a big difference for you in terms of your efficacy as a CSW or EA, but it also is a really important set of skills to have from the perspective of employers. And so you'll be much more likely to be a part of the teams where you want to work if you have them. So my tips are to make sure that you really do participate in the reviews. Don't skip through them. And that includes the content in the videos. And when you're asked to do some kind of journaling or blogging, really do use it. As well, read the readings that you're given. I know that students sometimes skip past those things, but they really will pay a price this time if they do. And one of the times that people tend to skip past things is if it has a lot of complex language or jargon. Some students have told me they find that with some of the readings here. But the aim is to make sure that you read them until you get comfortable with that content. You'll learn about the terms in our lectures. You can also look them up. And you can also, most importantly, just simply ask me if you come to any kind of troubles. Don't just move on or pretend that you know, because that will really bite you when it comes to the final exam. And more importantly, it'll bite you when you get out there in the field. On the other hand, when you really understand these terms, you'll be able to speak to people across disciplines, which will make you far more effective, far more comfortable, and far more impressive. Make sure that you understand this module is requiring comprehensive answers, not short form fill in the blank or match the answer to the other answer type of things. We're looking for people who really can problem solve and bring a set of things to the table. It's case-based. And start working early because of that, particularly on the major assignment, which we'll get to in a moment. Really important to break it into steps, and as you go through those steps, get help. To pass the course, you'll have 25% of your mark come from in-class participation. That will include reviews that we conduct in class, such as Kahoots or Socratic reviews or online practice exams. And it'll also include the work we do in classroom discussions. 25% of your mark will be for a final exam, and as I've said, that'll be largely case-based. It's not just about memory. Make sure you study by using cases, because you'll be asked to look at cases and identify what's going on and identify what should be going on. And 50% of your course will be for a literature researched essay. The literature researched essay is a capstone project and deserves a slide of its own. So what is the LRE, or literature researched essay? You will get a list of topics and more specific instructions as a document, but here's a bit of an introduction. When you graduate from this course, not only do I want you to be proficient in these tools, the behavior management tools, but I also want to know that you can write a university level paper, and that's the outcome we're looking for here. For most students, this paper is about 5 pages long in terms of the content. That doesn't include the sources list afterwards. You'll be given a list of topics, and you can choose whatever one you want from the list. It doesn't matter if somebody else has also chosen it. You may also come to me throughout the process and get help, as well as from the educational assistant, Janet, and have her give you feedback on things like your note-taking, your outlining, your thesis statements, and your draft. You can do that multiple times, and you'll see why that matters in a moment. Sometimes students aren't really turned on by the topics that I list, and they want to make a suggestion, and that's occasionally been allowed, but it's important to me that you choose a methodology, not just a subject in general. So it's really about choosing a set of tools that you might actually later on use in the workplace in the subject area of behavior management. And it's important that you'll be able to find resources that let you write about this subject in a way that gets into the nitty gritty of how it's used, to really be able to describe the how to of that particular topic. And you have to do that in a way that convinces me you understand it yourself. So throwing a lot of big words at me doesn't do that. It's really quite okay to have plain language, because then at least I can tell that you know what you're doing. As a literature researched essay and a university level paper, it's going to be more important than ever that you understand the policies around plagiarism and correct citation. Now, I'm not going to go through that again, but I have taught you that. And the most important thing I can tell you is there's no reason why you can't check to make sure you're doing it correctly before you hand it in. This is a capstone project, so it means it must be done and it must be passed in order for you to pass the whole program. So even if you pass the module but haven't passed the capstone, you'll be asked to do it until you do. And that's because this is a basic expectation of people in our field, to be able to write competently, to be able to help people write competently, and it will also be a vital skill as you continue your education. Like the review of citations, you can have me take a look at your work throughout the process, not just the citations, but the sources you choose, the outlining, every part of it, so that when you hand it in, you're 100% comfortable you're going to pass or do better than pass, and you won't have any kind of anxiety about it at all. That's really one of the key secrets here. All right, now that we've covered that, let's do some initial review. This module is called Advanced Behavior Management, so it's probably timely that we go back and talk about what behavior means. And I would remind you that behavior is action, or at least a state of action. People sitting or sleeping may not seem that active, but they're in a state of action. And how can we tell that something is a state of action? Well, you can see it or observe it using your other senses. For example, you could hear somebody running up and down the stairs, or you could smell the evidence that somebody was baking muffins. And because it's observable, it's measurable. There's lots of ways we measure it. For example, we measure its duration, how long it lasts, its frequency, how often it occurs, its intensity, for example, how loud something is, and even the space in between behaviors, called the interval. So behavior is always observable and measurable action. Something we have talked about but perhaps haven't emphasized is that we can also think of behavior as a toolkit of skills. A repertoire, we call this. And some people have lots of skills and some people don't have very many skills. Little kids don't have as much skill, for example, socially or in terms of their life skills as adults do. And as we go through our lives, we build up our toolkit so that we use the right tool for the right job. If you go into a restaurant and you want something to eat, I'm guessing as an adult you don't start crying and screaming, which you might have done when you were 2 or 3 years old. It wouldn't work very well for you as an adult, and so we stopped doing it. And that's going to be a foundation of what we learn here. Because most behavior is intentional, and all behavior fulfills a need. Sometimes you'll hear people say that behavior is communication. I'm not sure that's exactly true because communication suggests intention, but I think you can change it slightly and it would be true. All behavior communicates a need. And so if we listen carefully, and by listening I mean use all of our observational tools, we can start to understand what the person needs. And we can help them find a behavior that will work better for them. That's the whole foundation of this course. If I teach you a better way of doing something, you'll stop doing the less effective way. So we start by trying to understand the needs the person has and by helping them to meet them. We want to discern between behavior and feelings, thoughts, or physical symptoms. Sometimes the behavior is a great indicator of what people are feeling, what people are thinking, or what people are physically sensing. For example, if you give somebody a Valentine's Day card, they may assume that that behavior means you are interested in them romantically, that your feelings are romantically inclined. If you fall asleep, chances are other people will deduce that internally you are feeling tired. And if you raise your hand in a class, people might deduce that you don't understand something and that you think you need some clarification. But behavior isn't always 100% reliable. Actors aren't really feeling what they're acting out. And sometimes people act out in ways that are very cryptic or hard to understand. And that's particularly true of people who have mental health issues, medication side effects, intellectual or developmental disabilities, or maybe they're just young. Maybe they aren't acclimatized to our culture, which we call acculturated. All of these things can make somebody's behavior hard to interpret, and we need to slow down and be more careful about that. So we need to do some assessment. When we assess, we're doing something that's both ethically important because it's person-centered and dignified, and also more effective. We're likely to actually produce results. In the old days, we used to do things that were sort of one size fits all. Everybody went to a psych ward. Everybody got the same medicines. And of course, that didn't help very many people. Even worse, most people were actually done harm by that. So we really want to make sure that we do things that are likely to work for that person. When we assess, there are 3 types of assessment that we do. And the most important is the one in the orange box, functional assessment. When we functionally assess, what we're simply saying is we're trying to understand the needs of the person that they're trying to meet with their behavior. In other words, what's the function or use of that behavior? But we may also look at what we call a baseline. We don't do it instead of a functional assessment, but we would probably do it at the same time. A baseline is just really what things look like before we start to use behavioral management techniques. It's the before photo, and we'll later on compare what we have as outcomes against it to see if we're making a difference. There are 2 ingredients in the baseline. The first one is the scope, which is a number or set of numbers that describe how much something is happening. For example, we might describe how loud Johnny cries, or duration, how long Johnny cries, or frequency, how often Johnny cries. And sometimes we have a behavior based on just one specific problem there. Maybe Johnny doesn't cry too often, but he cries too loud. Or maybe Johnny doesn't cry too loud, but he cries forever and ever and ever too long. And so we want to be able to go back and see whether we've made the difference we intended. The other thing that we might come up with in the baseline is called the topography. And that's a fancy way of saying the shape of the behavior, what actually happens. And the topography might be what we're most interested in seeing change. Let me give you an example. If a little boy is in class and he puts his hand up and at the same time calls out, he's got a topographical issue. There's really no description here that he's doing it too often, that he's doing it too long, that he's doing it with too many spaces in between. The issue is simply the shape of his behavior. And if we can later on see that we change the shape of his behavior so that he raises his hand, waits to be called upon, and then speaks out, we will have made the difference we intended, even if the amount of time he does that doesn't change at all. And so that's another thing we want to sort of take a picture of before we start intervening. When people talk about the baseline, they want the number and they want the story, the qualitative and the quantitative. The qualitative is the story, the quantitative or the quantity is the numbers. Later on, when we go back and we compare what we're seeing, that's called a review. And we use the exact same things as we did with the baseline. We use the numbers and we use the topography. So we can see that somebody is crying less frequently, and if that's what we intended, we'll say we're making progress. If we can see that the topography is changing in the way we wanted, then again we can say we're making progress. So those are the 3 types of assessment that you'll hear us talk about throughout the process. Now this module doesn't really get into how to assess. So if you're in a second semester capacity, you've already had the assessment module. And if you're in a first semester, you'll get to it later on. This module assumes that people have done some assessment. So let's talk about behavior management. Well, first I would like to point out that there's another very similar term that we no longer use, and that is kind of loaded with lots of negative meaning for people. And that term is behavior modification. Even though the difference is subtle in these 2 terms, it's really powerful in what they mean. Behavior modification is a very old idea, and it's really no longer considered very socially valid, or in other words, people don't approve of it anymore. And the reason is that it used to do a lot of things that today we would consider very unethical. They were what we call aversive procedures. They were designed to cause pain or discomfort. And they were things like using cattle prods or tying people in their bed, putting them in restraints such as straitjackets or locking them in isolation rooms, giving them medicines that would put them to sleep or what we call chemically restrain people. Lots and lots of these types of things. Instead, today, behavior management is focused on what we call a positive approach. Positive doesn't mean nice or pleasant, although it does make it more nice and pleasant. Positive literally means like a plus sign. It adds to the person's repertoire. It gives them tools that they need and therefore helps them to meet their needs and therefore improves their quality of life. In other words, it's all good. That person benefits, and we tend to benefit because most times the behaviors that work better for people also work for everybody else around them. So behavior management is non-aversive. It's not based on pain, discomfort, or deterrence. If we do use consequences, and we'll get into that in more detail in a later video, we always make sure we're using a specific set of consequences that are approved. And we don't use them unless we need them. But we never use punishment. So when we say we don't use punishment, the term for that is non-punitive. That means we don't use any consequences that are arbitrary. If we are the only one who could have thought of that consequence, then it's a good sign that it's a punishment. And if the only reason the person's doing it is because we have power over them, that's another big clue. More on that later on. We are going to rely on something called the functional continuum. And some of you will have seen a very similar slide before, but we're going to introduce something different in this time going through it. When we look at our behaviors, we can describe them as fitting on this continuum, or essentially number line or rating system, in terms of whether or not they work well for us, don't work much at all, or work terribly and actually hurt us. And the basic truism or idea behind this is that people are more likely to use behaviors that give them what they want. We call that positive or negative reinforcement. The behavior is strengthened because it results in a desired outcome. And the better that it does that, the more that is going to be on this end of the spectrum, what we call the functional end. But here's a new word. We're not only going to call that the functional end, we're also going to call that the adaptive end. We're going to talk about the adaptive behaviors of people, which means their ability to adjust or find the right behavior for a given situation. And when behaviors are functional and adaptive, they work well. They help the person to fulfill the need, and they do it with less fuss and less muss. And we'll dive into that in the next slide. At the other end of the spectrum are behaviors that at first blush might appear to work for some time, in some cases. Not always. Sometimes they just don't work at all, and sometimes they work occasionally, sometimes they work every time, but they have a major consequence. So for example, over here, our person with the pen is studying hard, which is a pretty consistent way of doing well in a class. Over here on our dysfunctional end, a person is cheating. At first blush, they might think they've got the tiger by the tail. But if they get caught, and eventually they would, they're probably going to pay a big price. And so when we talk about behaviors being dysfunctional or maladaptive, they don't always look maladaptive at first blush. In the middle is something called the non-functional or non-adaptive. Now, technically speaking, there isn't really a behavior that perfectly fits this way, because every behavior takes at least a little bit of energy. But these behaviors really just simply could be described as not working well at all. They don't necessarily hurt us, but they don't help us. This lady's daydreaming instead of doing the test. She's not going to do well. She's not going to do worse than usual because of that. So that's a non-adaptive behavior. How do we tell whether something belongs on this far right side or this far left side? Well, that's on the next slide. But I want to point something out to you before we go to it, and that is that these arrows don't specifically have an ending. We are always looking for new ways to move over to the far right, to keep on finding something that's a new and improved way of doing things. And if we find it, we give up the old way. If we find a coffee shop that's closer to our house, serves better coffee, and is cheaper, we're going to stop going to the old coffee shop that we used to go to every day. So that's what we're always doing. And that's the same for people, whether they have disabilities or mental health issues. It can be harder to have them see or learn those things. It might take more time and more strategy, but it can be done. So we've already covered the first idea in the red box, that behavior can be put in these sort of very foggy categories of functional, non-functional, or dysfunctional. They're not really boxes, they're places on the line. But how does something get further and further to the right? Well, there are 6 things that we can do to make a behavior more functional. And one of the things that's not on this slide but really, really deserves to be written down is it's not important whether or not they're functional in our mind. They have to be what the individual we're supporting would consider to be functional. So that's an important lens to look through. The 6 criteria that will make a behavior more and more functional are that the new behavior is cheaper and easier than the old behavior. And cheap and easy doesn't just mean that it costs you less money, but it might cost you less time, it might cost you less emotional involvement, it might cost you less risk, it might cost you less energy. And so if we can do something that's easier and peasier, we're likely to do it. If it has a valuable payoff, that's also really going to help us to see that behavior as more functional. The more that we get for that behavior, the happier we are. And now imagine that I tell you you're going to do less, something is cheaper and easier, and it has a valuable payoff. You can see that it will really, really augment how functional that behavior will be. Now, another thing we can do is make it have an immediate or at least a quick payoff. The faster that something pays off, the better off we'll be. Next, the predictability. If I can tell you that it's going to work, or show you or demonstrate, that makes it more likely you'll use that behavior and see it as functional. And closely related to that is the idea that it works consistently. So even a dog can be trained by using this idea, because you can't explain to a dog that something's going to work, but if you get the dog used to a pattern, they'll start to see that something works for them every single time, and the dog's mind is trained to see that as a way of learning the lesson. Human beings are exactly the same way. And by the way, these last 3 ideas of quick payoff, predictability, and work consistently have a name. They're called contingent reward. In other words, we help people to come to understand that one thing will lead to another. The if-then relationship exists. If they do blank, then they'll get blank. So the first 2 ideas are about really making the amount of energy invested small and the amount of reward big. The next 3 ideas are about teaching the pattern to people by making sure that they pay off very quickly after the behavior, that they get told in advance, and that it works pretty much every time. Finally, the last idea is tied to the concept of negative reinforcement. If I can do something and it's not going to have negative side effects for me, then I'm more likely to do it. Back to our idea of the person who's a person who's cheating on a test. If that person could be absolutely certain that nothing bad would happen to them, probably more people would cheat. Why? Well, it's cheaper and easier. You get the same payoff as the person who studied. You could do it faster and be done with that test, and less time invested in the studying. You can see that you're going to get it right because you have the answers right in front of you, and getting the answers right always works. And so we've added this other one here. But unfortunately for that test cheater, it doesn't work that way. Typically, there are plenty of side effects. So here's your blog or work I want you to do before you move on to video number 2. I want you to sit down with a piece of paper or use the online blog and describe functional, non-functional, and dysfunctional behaviors that a person might use to get attention. If their aim is to fulfill the need of attention, describe it 1 functional, 1 non-functional, and 1 dysfunctional behavior for that need. Tell me how you knew that each of these fit in the category, and then answer this question. Would they be in the same category for every person? In other words, would some people consider the thing that you have as dysfunctional or non-functional to be functional if they were a different person than you? Okay, good luck with this. We'll move on to video 2 next, but feel free to talk to me about this if there's anything here that you don't clearly understand.